Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, Director of Foreign Affairs, National Security and Defense at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and welcome back to another edition of the Double Trouble podcast. And we're always so grateful for the support on this podcast from the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung Foundation here in Canada. So let's just jump right into it. And I want to introduce a couple of our great senior fellows, Marcus Kolga and Alexander Lanoszka. And the purpose of today's discussion, the three of us recently were at the GLOBESEC Prague Security Forum. And I think I just wanted to bring us all together. I know we had a lot of chats on the sidelines of this conference to get a few reflections, Marcus and Alexander, about what you kind of came away with. What were your sort of big takeaways from this big forum? Obviously, we had a lot of really important speakers there. We had the president of the European Commission. We had leaders from Finland, et cetera. We wish we had more representatives from Canada, as much as we were happy to be there. But maybe, Marcus, if I can start with you. And I think there's a number of, obviously, things burning on the international security environment, whether it's the strategic challenge that China poses, whether it's conflict in the Middle East. But I think the biggest issue, of course, rightfully so, that GLOBESEC was focused on was Russia's revisionism in Europe and obviously their aggression in Ukraine. So I want to start with you, Marcus. You attended a lot of the different sessions. What was your feeling now 2 years into this reignition of aggression, because it's been going on longer than that, what the resolve is in the room? You know, obviously we have a lot of headwinds coming up, not only the politics that we're seeing in Europe, but we have an election in the United States coming in November. What was your sort of sense, number one, of the forum, and what Canadians should be taking away from this?
Yeah, look, I think in that room, or in the rooms when we were in those discussions, you know, it was primarily Europeans. There, as you mentioned, there weren't too many Canadians. It was Labor Day. Not all that many Americans, other than the sort of the usual suspects like Kurt Volker and a few others. But the sense that I had that there was a real deep concern. First of all, deep concern that the weapons that have been committed to Ukraine, that their delivery has basically turned into a bit of a trickle, that they're not being delivered fast enough at this point, and that this has opened up a huge vulnerability in Ukraine. And this wasn't just the Ukrainians who were saying this. This was the EU ambassador to Ukraine, various different others who were deeply concerned about this. And you know, I think, you know, Gabrielius Landsbergis, the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I mean, he said it best. I mean, this is not just a Ukraine issue. This is an issue that will affect the globe, all nations of the world for years to come, if we do not ensure that Ukraine wins. And so I think that's sort of the message that I heard throughout the 2 days that we were there. Deep concern about Ukraine, deep concern that we're not doing enough about it. But also, you know, Landsbergis and others pointed to the success of Kursk. I think Landsbergis said it himself. We need more Kursk, and if we're going to get more Kursk out of Ukraine, that means more weapons being sent to Ukraine. So that's what I heard. The second point that I would make, and this is a personal point, was it was great to see Vladimir Kara-Murza there, the opposition leader who has twice poisoned, 2015, 2017 again, and then of course was arrested in 2022. He'd spent the past 10 months in solitary confinement, and so seeing him there, free, and hearing him in Prague was a real highlight for me.
I think that's great, and I agree. It was great to see him there, and great to see him on the stage. I wanted to pick up on one of your points and maybe bring Alexander into this discussion, because I'm glad that you mentioned the interventions from our Lithuanian friend. And one of the points that I thought actually the President von der Leyen also mentioned, which is a little bit too late, frankly, but I'm still happy she mentioned it, was that we should be listening, or we should have been listening more to our Central European allies and also our Baltic allies here. And I think this is something at the Institute we've put a lot of attention on for several years, and have been mentioning this consistently. But we've, frankly heard a lot of ignorance and silence often from our other colleagues. So it was nice to see that admission publicly at a high level. But again, going back to the action point, it's great to say we should listen to them. But what are the actual actions that are happening within the alliance, within some of the member states? Alexander, I want to pivot to you because you had a lot of work during this conference. You were speaking at one of the panels, and I think you might have had a second panel appearance as well. So you don't have to sort of tell us exactly what went down in those panels, but what were your reflections on these points? Do you agree on this issue of listening more to our Baltic friends? And what were some of your main takeaways from GLOBESEC?
Thanks, Jonathan. So I certainly heard those same deep concerns that Marcus had expressed as regards to what is happening in Ukraine, and especially with respect to the deliveries of military assistance to that country. I also heard, as you heard, a sense of validation that Central Eastern European countries were right about Russia all along, and unfortunately, Western European countries were slow on the take. I did feel like the summit was a little more upbeat than perhaps what I would have expected. And I wonder if the ambience in the room would have been much different had Biden remained on the ticket. I think there was a sense, still an unspoken sense, that the trend lines were actually not as negative as people might have believed them to be just a few months ago. I think there is a sense that Trump may win the election, but the chances of that happening are dwindling. And again, this is in the context of late August, early September, so even before the presidential debate on the 10th of September, to say nothing of Taylor Swift's endorsement thereafter. So I felt like there was a little more optimism. The theme of the summit was taming the storm, and of course, the storm remains untamed for all the reasons that Marcus had mentioned. But I think there's a sense that the problems are becoming a little more manageable, even if there are strong headwinds up ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point and an instructive point on the U.S. election. And the panel that I actually was speaking on was focused on the U.S. election and how European states should be thinking about this. Of course, Canada, we don't only have one neighbor. We always talk about our neighbor to the north as well, as much as we may or may not want them. But we do focus our politics, of course, thinking a lot about the United States, and we're thinking about this election too. I think one of the reflections I took away for that is that regardless of Trump or Harris, and obviously there are big differences there are things that are in our control here in Canada, and there are things in the control of many of the European member states that obsessing over this, as much as it's a great parlor game, going back to the fundamentals, whether it's on trade issues and tariffs, or whether it's on national security and defense culture and spending, there's a lot that can be done regardless of the candidates. But I did get that sense from you, Alexander, and I almost worry that it's an overinflated sense of comfort too. So, I mean, in my trips to Europe over the past year, for example, there was a lot of anxiety 8 months ago, 9 months ago, for all of the reasons that I think you noted. I also felt this sense of sort of relief at the GLOBESEC forum. But again, this is still a very, very tight race. I think if there's an expectation that even the lines behind Trump are gone, I think it's maybe sort of an overreaction. But I did want to pivot, and Marcus, feel free if you want to jump in on that. But I want to pivot back, Marcus, maybe to you on this point, and to bring China into the discussion. One of the remarkable panels that I found, anyways, was Taiwan's National Security Council Secretary General Joseph Wu, and I don't know if you were able to catch this, but the very strong presence of Taiwan in this forum. I think dating back to thinking of many different European security forums, China, and thinking about China, even in the Russia-China context, was almost a footnote. It would be something that would be found on day 3 at the end of the conference when everyone is already taking their flights back. Seeing concerns about China now being fairly front and center. Again, of course, Russia's war in Ukraine remains the primary focus. But what was your sense, Marcus, on how China was addressed in this conference? and what some of the implications are for allies like Canada.
Yeah, no, look, I think in most of the panels that I attended, and certainly in the meetings that I had on the sidelines, China came up all the time. China is clearly a part of Russia's war against Ukraine. They're part of that threat. They are, I think there's the growing recognition of their role in that conflict. And I think that there's a certain degree of courage sort of building up in the West to stand up and call that out, whereas that was completely absent, I think, 2 years ago at the start of this conflict. So yeah, a sense of that recognition, the need to stand up, and the fact that Taiwan really was that present at GLOBESEC, along with so many of those other Central and Eastern European countries, the Baltic countries. They were really given a large platform at that conference. So I think all of that was, I took it was quite positive in terms of what I was seeing.
Okay, that's great. And maybe if I can move that question to Alexander, I know you've put a good amount of attention on Taiwan and East Asia in some of your scholarly work. What sort of message does this have for Canada? Because I think one of the interesting things that Marcus just mentioned was sort of bravery or courage. And it seems while we've been moving incrementally forward on doing more with Taiwan, for example, in the Indo-Pacific strategy, Taiwan was referenced 8 or 9 times, not purely on economic issues, disinformation, actually a number of different references in the Indo-Pacific strategy on this. Yet I think of something like having their former foreign minister, somebody like Joseph Wu, on a big platform with the president of Czech Republic at the exact same forum on the exact same day. And it blows my mind thinking of that potential in Canada. I would love to see something like that. And of course, selfishly, MLI would love to have its good offices used for that. But do you think Canada is behind the 8 ball on this sort of, whether it's courage, whether it's standing up for the things that we believe in, and whether Taiwan could be a part of that discussion going forward?
Unlike Marcus, I didn't hear much about China at GLOBESEC, and that might just be a reflection of the European bias of the panels and events that I attended while at GLOBESEC. And I would even note that, considering that we're recording this conversation on the 11th of September, even in the presidential debate, I don't even think China came up once. There was very little mention of it, very much unlike in 2016 when Hillary Clinton squared off against Donald Trump. But to answer your question directly, I don't think Canada is on the ball whatsoever. Indeed, even with respect to what Marcus and I would call low-hanging fruit of foreign disinformation propagated by Russia, we're not really doing much there. There was a story that has since broken out in the last week or so about Russian financing right-wing media to promote particular narratives favorable to the Kremlin. There are Canadian connections in that particular story that are very much troubling. And I don't really see the federal government doing much there. So even with respect to issues relating to Russia, I'm not even sure if Canada is on top of things as well as it could. So by that account, with respect to China, I think Canada is even further behind. So to answer your question most directly, no, I do not think that we're doing a sufficient job in addressing these sorts of threats.
Yeah, and I mean, I think going back to the issue of leadership, and I mean, it may seem like a point of semantics, and Marcus's point well taken on Labor Day, and everyone deserves a rest, except the 3 of us who took our Labor Day and went to Prague. But my point is that I think you see opportunities here to promote your narratives and promote your interests and promote your foreign policy, and I see this as another missed opportunity. Frankly, we saw a lot of distinguished colleagues and partners there that took those opportunities to promote their interests, whether it's on supporting Ukraine, whether it's on Russia, China, whether it's on other issues, disinformation, et cetera. But it seems that we did not do that. So again, this is something where I feel like if Canada wants to be seen as one of the leaders or a part of the solution, we got to be at the table. As much as I love Alexander Lanoszka, and you were at the table multiple times, and Marcus Kolga too, we need some official Canadian voice there as well.
just for our listeners to know, Global Affairs Canada did contribute to the program. You would find the logo of Global Affairs Canada on most print materials distributed and presented at the workshop. However, as you, Jonathan, just had mentioned, in terms of speaking, in terms of being present on actual panels, there was very, very little representation, if any at all.
Yeah, and I'd only add that I think that Canada has actually a lot to be quite proud of and a lot to talk about in terms of its contributions. Alexander brought up Russian information operations. Global Affairs and the RRM team there are doing an outstanding job. And in fact, at GLOBESEC, I had a lot of people comment on the work that RRM is doing within the G7 and sharing intelligence about various different Russian information operations. And so, I think that our senior elected officials really should be showing up at these sorts of events. I know that, there may be some concern about being schooled on various different aspects of our defense spending and such. And there may be, a reluctance to expose themselves to that. But I think there's still a lot of positives that we can bring to events like this. And so I think it's really important that that Canada does turn up. Now, on that, the issue of Russian information influence operations, I think one of the positive things, the big positive things that I took from this was the Assistant Secretary General for NATO, for public diplomacy. She was on a number of panels, Marie Doa Besançon, and she was aggressively talking about the need to start disrupting those operations. And I think all of us have been to these conferences over the past few years, and we've often, most of these conferences, at them we're talking about the problem, we're admiring the problem. But I haven't heard someone at that level talk about the need to now start actively disrupting them. And so, that was a huge, I think, positive step to hear someone at a conference like this talking about that. And I think Canada does have a role to play in those, in the disruption of those activities. And this is what we saw in the US, that indictment last week against those 2 RT employees. That's an example of this sort of disruption. The FBI also unsealed an affidavit clearly describing these efforts in the Russian doppelganger campaign, how they targeted Western societies, and Canada was among them. So more of that is necessary, and further to that specific issue, Canada does need to open up an investigation, because Canada was central to that campaign, to that tenant media operation. So opening up an investigation to figure out to what extent Canadians were involved in it, whether any of our sanctions laws were violated, and to also look into other collaborators in Canada who are working with RT and other sanctioned Russian think tanks. It's really necessary if we want to start deterring and stopping these sorts of activities.
Well, thanks a lot, Marcus. And that's a great point, also highlighting the recent case, but the need for disruption. And I wholeheartedly agree on that. I think that we've been on the defensive for too long, and there's many ways that you could think of the disruption being articulated. I think one way is legal, and I think it's great to use transparency and sunlight to show the details of, even if that involves releasing some intelligence and security that shows how these networks operate and exactly what Russia and other adversaries are trying to do. I think the other piece, which maybe wasn't discussed and can't be discussed as easily, is being much more offensive in nature, and even using subversion when necessary. We are dealing with an adversary that does not care about the thresholds that we care about and that we artificially impose. And we do have those capabilities to impose, but we've been hesitant, traditionally quite hesitant. And I think the Canadian side is as guilty as others are to use those capabilities to the full extent. I wanted to quickly, and Alexander, you may have some things to add on this, but I wanted to quickly go back to you, Marcus, on thinking about our sort of center of excellence, or our building capabilities on disinformation. And I see you as the hub of that. But in government, you're right. I think credit does deserve to go to the RRM. I think there's a lot of great capabilities there. I think they've done some really good work and continue to do good work. How, from a public diplomacy, so engaging folks on that, Yes, it would be nice for them to show up at a few conferences, but what could we own in that narrative space? Whether it's a disinformation series of summits, lecture series, is something that we could do more to, if we're putting all of these efforts and resources into the government, we have these capabilities, and we have civil society actors and thought leaders like yourself who are working on this. What could we be doing more to really push out this and own this brand more as Canada?
That's a great question. We do have all these great resources that we've built up. We've unfortunately built them up in silos. We're not coordinating those efforts in any sort of strategic way, and this is something that we need to start doing. There's one area where there's a big gap in terms of Russian, Chinese, Iranian influence and information operations. That's transnational repression. I think that a lot of our allies are slowly starting to acknowledge this threat. Canada is to a certain degree as well. But given the number, the diversity of our country, the fact that transnational repression has affected multiple communities in this country, that we have an understanding of that diversity, I think there's a real, this is a space that Canada could become active in working with our allies to start coordinating efforts to detect these sorts of operations, to start calling them out and making sure that law enforcement amongst our allied nations are working with each other to hold to account those nations and those players who are active in this area, and to make sure that those vulnerable communities, the activists, the journalists, are protected to some degree, because right now it's really the Wild West out there when it comes to transnational repression. And so there are a few opportunities coming up. Canada is leading the G7 next year. We could be putting transnational repression onto the agenda at the next G7. We have the NATO PA coming up in Montreal. Transnational repression in terms of national security could be brought up there as a topic. So I think there's a real opportunity here for Canada to lead on that issue.
I think that's a great point, Marcus. And I think, Canada, unfortunately, is often seen, being used as a petri dish for this, and the vulnerabilities are falling on many of our citizens and permanent residences and those in our diaspora communities who are suffering. One of the countries suffering greatly from transnational repression. So it's a really good point. So I know we got to finish up pretty quickly. Marcus, you got to head off, but I wanted to give the last line here to Alexander, and it's going to be, sorry for the very difficult question, but you've been focusing a lot of your work on Russia's war in Ukraine. Regardless of politics down in the United States in November, regardless of what may happen here in Canada, whether it's in the fall, the spring, next fall, what would be your sort of 2 or 3 top lines on the war in Ukraine that Canadians, what sort of policy recommendations would you say, regardless of our own politics, that we're not doing right now? As said, everyone's admiring the problem, as Marcus mentioned. You're not going to find many people in the political class here that say, look, we don't feel like we should be supporting Ukraine. But what are we failing to do? And what are the things that are within our capacity relatively quickly to do that we just simply have not been doing?
That is a very difficult question. I suppose what comes top of mind is that I think we're facing a peculiar situation whereby the Canadian government, as well as extreme critics on both the left and the right, overstate what Canada has done for Ukraine. We actually have not really done that much for Ukraine. We have been shy about giving lethal military equipment even before the 24th of February. We have given a bit, but mostly from older stockpiles. We have not really replenished what we have given already. We have economic firepower, but we have let our military capabilities attrit over the course of the last few decades, and that has really hampered our ability to do much for that country since 2022. So I think that's an uncomfortable truth. And I think it means that we need to really shore up our defense industry and have a much more frank conversation about what sort of military posture this country should have, in addition to what sort of military assistance we can really provide to Ukraine, or really any ally or partner that might come under threat in the near term.
Okay, thanks so much, Alexander. Gentlemen, thanks very much. We're clearly going to have part 2 and 3, but I know we're out of time for today. Markus Kolga, Alexander Lanoszka, thanks so much. It was a pleasure being in Prague with you both. Thank you to our listeners for another edition of the Double Trouble podcast here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and we'll look forward to next time.